On a storm-soaked piece of Arizona land, a widowed cowboy named Tom Redern had just wrestled a drowning calf from the mud and figured his night was done. But then lightning tore open the sky, and a lone rider appeared at his gate. She was a young woman, maybe in her mid-twenties, drenched to the bone, but sitting up as straight as a fence post. She looked him dead in the eye and said she was not lost. She came looking for him because 20 years ago he tied himself to a post, waded into a flooded creek, and dragged her out. And she never forgot the words he told her after. Stay brave. Do not let life break you. If you'll want to see how far a good deed can travel, you will want to stay till the end. Go ahead and hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story goes. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Thank you for being part of our community.
The rain had been falling for 3 days straight. Not the gentle kind that taps on the roof and puts a man to sleep, but the hard, angry kind that turns dirt roads into rivers and makes every step outside a war. Tom Redern stood in his barn doorway, watching sheets of water hammer the corral, and felt that old, familiar ache settle deep in his bones. It was the kind of ache that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with being alone. He was 42 years old and a widower for 6 of them. On nights like this, when the wind howled and the thunder shook the canyon, he could still hear his Sarah's voice, telling him to come inside before he caught his death. But Sarah was gone, buried on the hill overlooking the creek, under a cottonwood tree she had planted the year they were married. And Tom had learned how to live with ghosts. He pulled his hat down lower and stepped out into the storm. The calf was stuck deep in the mud near the eastern fence, crying its lungs out, its legs churning uselessly against the slick earth. Tom slogged through the downpour, his boots sinking ankle-deep with every step, and grabbed the rope coiled on his shoulder. The little animal's eyes rolled white with panic as he got closer. But Tom's hands were steady. They always were. He had been working cattle since he was 12 years old, and he had stopped making time for fear a long, long time ago. Easy now, he murmured, slipping the rope around the calf's chest. Easy. The mud sucked at his boots as he heaved backward, his muscles straining, rain pouring down his face. The calf pulled free with a wet, sloppy sound and scrambled to its feet, shaking off mud and fear all at once. Tom watched it bolt for the barn, then just stood there for a minute, catching his breath, letting the rain wash the sweat and grime away. That is when he saw her. At first, he thought the lightning was playing tricks on him, just a flash of white against the dark sky. There 1 second, gone the next. But then the thunder faded, and she was still there. A rider, sitting perfectly still on a paint horse at the far end of his property, outlined against the storm like something out of a bad dream. Tom's hand moved to the rifle slung over his back without him even thinking about it. But the rider did not move. She did not raise a weapon or shout a challenge. She just sat there, waiting, while the rain poured down and the wind tore at her hair. Tom walked toward the gate, every one of his senses on high alert. Out here, strangers did not just show up in the middle of a storm, not unless they were running from something or looking to start trouble. He stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see her clearly now. She was young, mid to late 20s, he figured, with dark hair plastered to her shoulders and a face that looked like it was carved from something harder than stone. Her eyes were steady and unflinching, the kind of eyes that had seen things and refused to look away. "You lost?" Tom asked, his voice loud enough to be heard over the wind. "No." Her voice cut through the storm like a hot knife through butter, calm, certain, and not shaken one bit. Tom's grip on the rifle eased up just a little. "Then what are you doing on my land?" The woman swung down from her horse with an easy grace, her boots hitting the mud without making a sound. She walked toward the gate, and Tom found himself taking a step back. There was something in the way she moved, deliberate and full of purpose, like every single step had been planned out years ago. "I came here on purpose," she said. Tom just stared at her. Rain dripped from the brim of his hat, making puddles at his feet. "Lady, I do not know what you are talking about." The woman's gaze did not waver. "My name is Alyssa Morgan. 20 years ago, during a flood at Red Creek, you saved my life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Tom's mouth went dry. His mind scrambled backward, digging through all the layers of memory, searching for anything that would make sense of this moment. Red Creek, the flood 20 years ago. And then it hit him. A little girl, maybe 8 years old, trapped in the current, clinging to a branch while the water tore at her, and all the adults on the bank just screamed and stood there frozen. Tom had been 22, young and foolish, and too angry at the world to care about his own safety. He had tied himself to a fence post with 50 feet of rope and waded into the flood, because no one else would. He remembered the cold, the way the current had tried to rip his legs out from under him, and the feel of the girl's small hands grabbing his shirt, like he was the only solid thing left in the whole universe. And afterward, when he had pulled her onto the bank, and she had been shaking so hard her teeth rattled, he had crouched down and looked her in the eye and said the only thing that made sense at the time: "Stay brave. Do not let life break you." Tom's breath came out shallow now, his chest feeling tight. "You were just a kid." Alyssa nodded slowly. "I was, and you were the only person who did not freeze. That was a long time ago. 20 years, she agreed. But I never forgot." Tom shook his head, trying to make this all make sense. "So you rode out here in the middle of a storm to say thank you." "That is, I did not come to say thank you," Alyssa interrupted quietly. "I came to stay." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tom stared at her, rainwater streaming down his face, trying to process what he had just heard. "Stay, yes, here." "Yes, you are serious." Alyssa's expression did not change. "I have been riding toward this moment my whole life, Mr. Redern. I'm not turning around now." Tom opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. His brain felt like it had been struck by lightning, sparking and misfiring, unable to grab hold of anything solid. "You cannot just," he started, then stopped. "I do not even know you." "Not yet," Alyssa said simply. "But you will." The sheer audacity of it left him speechless. This woman, this stranger, had ridden onto his property in the middle of a storm and calmly announced her intention to turn his entire life upside down, and she said it like it was the most natural thing in the world. Tom dragged a hand down his face. "Lady, I think you have lost your mind." "Maybe," Alyssa said, "but I am still here." For a long moment, neither of them moved. The rain poured down, the wind howled, and Tom felt something crack open inside his chest, something he had kept locked away for 6 long years. Finally, he sighed and pushed the gate open. "You better come inside before you drown." The cabin was small, one main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen table scarred by years of use, and a bedroom tucked into the back corner. Sarah's quilt still hung on the walls. Her rocking chair still sat by the fire. Tom had not changed a thing since she died, and he knew it showed. Alyssa stood just inside the doorway, dripping water onto the floorboards, looking around with the quiet intensity of someone cataloging every detail. Tom grabbed a towel from a shelf and tossed it to her. "Dry off," he said gruffly. "I will put some coffee on." He moved to the stove, feeding kindling into the firebox, trying to keep his hands busy while his mind raced. This was insane. Completely, utterly insane. He did not know this woman, did not owe her anything. The fact that he had pulled her out of a creek 2 decades ago did not mean she had the right to show up. "And you?" Alyssa said quietly. Tom glanced over his shoulder. She was standing near the fireplace now, a towel draped over her shoulders, studying the photographs on the mantel. "How would you know?" My father brought me here once after the flood. He wanted to thank you properly, but you were not home." She touched the edge of a frame. Tom and Sarah on their wedding day, young and hopeful and unbearably alive. Your wife was here. She gave me lemonade and told me you had gone into town. Tom's throat tightened. Sarah. Her name was a soft whisper from Alyssa. She had a kind heart, I remember that. She wanted to know about my schooling, and she listened like it was the most important thing in the world. The coffee pot started to whistle, and Tom poured out 2 mugs, his hands having a slight tremble to them. He placed one on the table and motioned for Alyssa to have a seat. She did, moving with a quiet and deliberate grace. And she held that mug like it was the first bit of warmth she had felt in a long, long time. Tom sat down across from her, studying her features in the glow of the fire. She looked worn out, not just tired from the ride, but a weariness that went clean down to the bone, the kind that comes from carrying a heavy burden for far too long. "Why tonight?" he asked her. "If you have been turning this over in your mind for 20 years, why in the world would you show up now?" Alyssa took a sip of her coffee, her eyes looking off into the distance. "Because I spent those 20 years trying to live up to the words you gave me. Stay brave. Do not let this life break you. I clung to those words like a drowning man to a rope. Through losing my mother, through my father's drinking, through every single person who told me I was not strong enough or smart enough or good enough." She finally looked up, and Tom saw pure steel in her eyes. "I made it through, and I made a promise to myself that when I was strong enough, I would come back to this place and build the life I was meant to have." "On my ranch," Tom stated flatly. "On the land where my true life began," Alyssa corrected him. "The place I was saved." Tom slammed his cup down on the table. "This is not some fairy tale, Miss Morgan. This is my home and my life. You cannot just ride in here." "And I am not looking for a handout," Alyssa said quietly. "I can work. I understand horses, cattle, and fencing. I can cook, I can mend, and I can handle a rifle. I'm not here to take anything. I am here to earn my place." Tom stared at her hard, trying to find a hint of madness or desperation, but all he found was certainty. It was an unshakable, absolute certainty. "And if I tell you no?" Alyssa met his stare and did not so much as blink. "Then I suppose I will sleep in your barn until you tell me yes." In spite of himself, Tom felt a small flicker of something. Maybe amusement, maybe just frustration. He could not rightly tell which. "You are a stubborn woman." "I am an alive woman," Alyssa said simply. "And because of you, that has to mean something." Tom shook his head slow, feeling the true weight of that moment settle on him like a heavy winter coat. He thought about Sarah, and about the empty years since her passing, and the way the silence had wrapped itself around this cabin like a funeral shroud. And he thought about a little girl clinging to a tree branch in a flooded creek, her eyes wide with pure terror, and the promise he had made to her without a second thought: stay brave. One week, he heard the words come out of his own mouth. "You can stay for 1 week. Prove you can handle the work that needs doing. After that, we will just have to see." Alyssa's expression did not change one bit, but a little something in her eyes seemed to soften. "Thank you." Tom stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly on the floor. "There is a spare room just off the kitchen. It used to be for storage. You can sleep in there." He grabbed his hat and made for the door. "I will get your horse settled in the barn." He did not wait for her to reply. He just stepped back out into the pouring rain, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood there for a minute, just letting the storm wash over him. What in the hell had he just agreed to? The morning came cold and clear. Tom woke up to pale sunshine pouring through his window and the smell of coffee already brewing. For a second, he thought he might have dreamed the whole entire thing. Then he heard someone moving around in the kitchen, the soft sound of dishes, the creak of the old floorboards, and it all came rushing back. Alyssa Morgan was right here in his house. He got dressed in a hurry and stepped out into the main room. Alyssa was standing at the stove, stirring something in a heavy cast-iron skillet, with her hair pulled back in a simple braid. She had changed out of her wet clothes and into something much more practical: a work shirt, canvas pants, and boots that had seen some hard miles. She looked like she belonged there. That single thought bothered him more than anything else. "Eggs," she said, without even turning to look at him. "And the last of your bacon. You need to go into town and restock your pantry." Tom just grunted and poured himself a cup of coffee. "I was not expecting company." "You ought to eat," Alyssa said, sliding a full plate onto the table. "It is going to be a long day ahead." Tom sat down slowly, just watching her move about his kitchen like she had been doing it 100 times before. She did not ask where anything was. She did not pause for a second. She just worked with a quiet efficiency that made something in his chest twist up uncomfortably. "You cook like this all the time?" he asked her. "I cook like someone who learned at a young age that if you do not feed yourself, nobody else is going to," Alyssa said, plain and simple. Tom chewed his food slowly, tasting the meaning behind her words. "Your father." Alyssa's hands stopped what they were doing for just a split second. "He did the best he could, but after my mother passed on, his best was not always enough." Tom gave a slow nod. He understood that feeling. He had lived it himself, just in different ways. "And now he's gone too," Alyssa said in a quiet voice. "Pneumonia got him last winter. I am sorry to hear that. Do not be." She met his gaze with a steady look. "He taught me how to survive. That is more than some people ever get." They ate the rest of their meal in silence, and Tom found himself studying her in the morning light. There was something about the way she held her shoulders, the way she carried herself, like she had been tested by life and had not broken. Like she had walked right through a fire and came out on the other side, forged into something even stronger. When they were done, Alyssa took their plates without having to be asked, and then turned to face him. "Where do you want me to start?" Tom stood up, grabbing his work gloves from a shelf by the door. "The eastern fence line took some damage in the storm. It needs to be repaired before the cattle start to drift." Alyssa nodded just once and followed him out the door. The work was hard, and it was relentless. Tom set a punishing pace, not because he wanted to see her fail, but because he had to know if she was truly serious, if she could handle the hard reality of this life, not just some romantic notion of it. Alyssa met every single challenge without a word of complaint. She hauled heavy fence posts. She drove staples. She stretched wire until her hands were raw and blistered. When the sun climbed high and the heat soaked through her shirt, she just kept on working. When Tom pointed out a section that was sagging and told her it needed to be torn down and completely rebuilt, she just grabbed the crowbar and got right to it. They worked side by side until the sun was high and brutal in the sky. Finally, Tom called for a break and handed her his canteen. Alyssa drank from it deeply, then wiped her mouth on the back of her hand and looked out over the canyon, at the miles of red rock and scrub brush that stretched all the way to the horizon. "It sure is beautiful," she said softly. Tom followed her gaze. He had lived here his entire life, and sometimes he forgot to really look at it. "It is hard country." "Hard does not mean it is not worth it," Alyssa said. Tom glanced over at her, surprised by her words. "You sound like Sarah." Alyssa turned to him, her expression soft. "Your wife?" "Yeah." Tom's voice came out rougher than he meant it to. "She used to say that all the time. Hard does not mean it is not worth it." She was right. Tom nodded slowly, his throat feeling tight. She usually was. They stood there for a quiet moment, just two people connected by a memory and by circumstance, while the wind whispered. Through the canyon and the sun beat down on the land they were both trying to call their own. Then the sound of hoofbeats broke the silence. Tom turned, his hand moving on pure instinct, to the rifle he had propped against a fence post. A rider was coming up from the west, a tall, broad-shouldered man who sat his horse like he was born to the saddle. Tom relaxed a little and raised a hand to wave. Elias. The rider came closer, and Tom saw the exact moment his look of recognition turned into one of surprise. Elias Greycloud pulled his horse to a halt and just stared at Alyssa with open curiosity. "Tom," Elias said slowly, his eyes never leaving Alyssa, "you did not mention you had taken on some company." "Did not know I needed your permission," Tom said dryly. Elias swung down from his horse, moving with the easy grace of a man who had spent more time in the wild country than in any town. He was Navajo, 10 years younger than Tom, with dark eyes that did not miss a single thing and a quiet strength that made men twice his size think twice about starting any trouble. He was also Tom's best friend and had been for 15 years. "Elias Greycloud," he said, holding a hand out to Alyssa. "I work the spread to the north of here." Alyssa shook his hand firmly. "Alyssa Morgan." Elias glanced at Tom, his eyebrows raised in a silent question. Tom sighed and leaned back against the fence post. "It is a long story." "I have got the time," Elias said. Tom looked over at Alyssa. She met his gaze evenly, and he saw the question in her eyes. "Is this your story to tell, or is it mine?" Tom took a deep breath, and then he told it. He told Elias all about the flood at Red Creek, about a little girl trapped in the raging current, and about the words he had spoken to her afterward that had somehow traveled across 20 years and brought a stranger to his front door in the middle of a storm. When he was done, Elias stood there very still for a good while, letting it all sink in. Then he looked over at Alyssa with a newfound respect. "Well, now, that is a heavy promise to keep," he said, his voice low. "What he did was a heavy wrong," Alyssa answered right back. Elias gave a slow nod and then turned his gaze to Tom. "You certain about this?" "No," Tom said with complete honesty. "But she is here anyway." Elias looked deep into Tom's face, reading all the things that had not been spoken. Then a small, knowing smile touched his lips. "All right, then. If you need another set of hands on that fence line, I can stick around." Tom felt a tightness in his chest just let go. "I would appreciate that." The three of them got to work, staying at it until the sun began to dip below the far hills. Elias turned out to be good company, breaking the quiet with old stories and thoughts that even made Alyssa crack a smile. And Tom, well, he found himself watching her. The way she moved, the way she paid attention, the way she fell into the rhythm of the work like she had been born to it. When they finally decided to call it a day and started back for the cabin, Elias held Tom back for a moment. "She means business," Elias said softly. "I know, and you are scared." Tom's jaw went tight. "I am not." "You are," Elias said, cutting him off gently. "And there is nothing wrong with that. But do not let being scared make you a fool." Tom looked at his old friend and saw the genuine concern in his eyes. "What are you trying to say?" "I am saying that woman rode straight through a storm just to get to this place. That has to mean something. And maybe, just maybe, it is about time you stopped dancing with ghosts." Before Tom could even think of a reply, Elias was back on his horse, riding off into the growing twilight. Tom just stood there watching him go, feeling the truth of those words settle deep inside him. Then he turned and walked back to the cabin, where warm light spilled from the windows and smoke drifted up from the chimney. And for the first time in 6 long years, the silence did not feel quite so heavy. After that, the days started finding their own groove. Work began at dawn. It was hard, honest labor under that blistering Arizona sun. They shared their meals in a quiet kind of companionship. The evenings were spent near the fire. They were usually too worn out for much talk, but the silence between them was comfortable. Alyssa proved her worth time and time again. She could mend a tack with hands as steady as a surgeon's, move a herd with a quiet confidence you just cannot teach. And she handled all the little troubles that come with ranch life. A horse that came up lame, a water pump that gave out, a rattlesnake coiled up in the barn. She met it all with a calm know-how that only comes from hard-won experience. Tom found himself watching her more than he probably should have. He started noticing the little things. The way she would hum a little tune while she worked. The way she always made sure the animals were cared for before she thought of herself. The way she looked out at the land, like it was something precious, something worth fighting for. She brought his Sarah to mind, not in the way she looked, but in her spirit. That same fierce will, that same stubborn refusal to ever be broken. And that scared him more than he would ever say out loud. On the 5th day, they rode into town to get supplies. Tom had not planned on bringing her along, but when he mentioned he was heading into Mesa Ridge, Alyssa had just saddled her horse and said, "I will go with you." And for some reason, Tom did not argue. Mesa Ridge was a real small town, the kind of place where folks know your business, and a stranger stood out like a sore thumb. Tom could feel eyes on his back the second their horses set foot on Main Street. He saw curtains twitch in the windows and could hear the whispers start up. He told himself he did not care one bit, but his shoulders tensed up all the same. They hitched their horses outside the general store, and Tom pushed his way through the door, with Alyssa right behind him. Fella behind the counter, old man Hendricks. He looked up from his books and just plain froze. "Tom," Hendricks said, real slow, his eyes sliding over to Alyssa. "Did not figure on seeing you in town today." "Need supplies?" Tom said, cutting him short as he pulled out his list. Hendricks nodded, but he could not take his eyes off Alyssa. And who might this be? Before Tom could get a word out, Alyssa stepped right up and held out her hand. "Alyssa Morgan," she said. "I am helping out over at the Redfern Ranch. You could have heard a pin drop." Those words just hung there in the air. Hendricks stared at her offered hand for a long moment before he finally took it, his face a perfect mask. "Is that a fact?" "It is," Alyssa said, calm as can be. Tom could feel the air in the room grow thick with questions that nobody was asking. He grabbed a sack of flour and slammed it down on the counter harder than he needed to. "Can we just get on with it?" Hendricks started pulling things from the list, but Tom could see him still watching Alyssa from the corner of his eye. He could feel the judgment just building up in that store. They got through the whole thing in a tense, heavy silence. Tom paid his money, they gathered up their things, and he was almost to the door when a voice sliced through the quiet. "Well, looky here. Looks like Tom Redfern finally found himself a new lady friend." Tom stopped dead in his tracks. He turned around slow and saw Frank Mallory leaning up against the back wall, a sharp, ugly grin plastered on his face. Frank was nothing but trouble. Always had been. He was a bully as a boy who had grown up to be a mean drunk, the kind of man who enjoyed making other people feel small. "This is not your concern, Frank," Tom said, keeping his voice steady. Frank pushed himself off the wall and moseyed on over, his eyes crawling all over Alyssa with pure disrespect. "Seems like it is my concern, seeing as how you are showing her off all over town. What is the matter, Tom? Did Sarah's side of the bed finally get too cold for you?" A hot, red anger washed over everything. Tom set the supplies down, real careful. Too careful. Then he turned to face Frank square on. "You want to say that again?" Frank's smirk got wider, I said. Tom's fist connected right on his jaw. Frank hit the floor hard, sending a display of canned beans scattering everywhere, blood already trickling from his split lip. The whole store went quiet as a tomb. Then Frank scrambled to his feet with a yell and came at him. Tom just sidestepped, caught Frank's arm, and used the man's own forward motion to plant him face first into the checkout counter. Frank folded up and stayed down this time, just groaning. Tom stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles scraped and bleeding. "Stay down." He turned around and saw Alyssa looking at him with an expression he just could not figure out. It was not shock, and it was not fear, but something else entirely. It looked almost like she understood. "We are finished here," Tom said softly. He picked up their supplies and headed out the door with Alyssa right behind him, not saying a word. They drove back to the ranch without talking, but Tom could feel the whole town's eyes on them the entire way. And he knew deep in his bones, that this was only the start of it. That night, Tom sat out on the porch looking into the blackness, trying to bank the fire of anger still burning inside him. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Alyssa came out holding 2 mugs of coffee. She offered one to him and settled on the step next to him. For a good long while, neither one of them said anything. Finally, Alyssa was the one to speak. "Thank you." Tom looked over at her, taken aback. "For what?" "For standing up for me." Tom just shook his head. He had no right. He surely did not, Alyssa agreed. But most men would not have done a thing. They would have just let it go, told me to pay it no mind. She held his gaze. "You did not." Tom took a swallow of coffee, not sure he could trust his own voice. "I know this is not simple," Alyssa went on in a low voice. "Me being here, people are bound to talk. They are going to pass judgment, and for that I am sorry." "Do not be," Tom said, his voice rough. "You did not ask for any of this. I made a choice. So did you. That is all that should matter." Alyssa offered a small, faint smile. "Is it?" Tom met her eyes. "It has to be." They sat there in the dark, their shoulders almost touching, as the stars turned in the sky above and the land stretched out all around them, huge and unforgiving, and so beautiful it hurt. And from somewhere way off in the distance, Tom heard the rumble of thunder echoing through the canyon. Another storm was on its way. But for this one, he was not going to be facing it by himself. The storm finally hit 3 days later, but it was not rain that came pouring down on them. Tom was out mending the barn door when Sheriff Amos Lyle rode into the yard, his deputy right behind him like a stray dog. Tom recognized the look on Lyle's face. He had seen it on other men who had to deliver bad news they would rather not, but would all the same because it was their job. "Tom," Lyle said, giving a nod of his hat, "you got a spare minute?" Tom put down his hammer and wiped his dusty hands on his jeans. "That all depends on what brings you out here, Amos." Lyle fidgeted in his saddle, looking mighty uncomfortable. "Had a few folks stop by the office yesterday, voicing some concerns." "What sort of concerns?" "The kind of concerns about a woman living out here with you, not married and without a chaperone." Lyle's eyes darted toward the cabin where Alyssa was pinning laundry to the line. "Folks are talking, Tom." "And not in a good way?" Tom felt a slow heat build in his chest. "Let them talk." "It is not that easy," Lyle said gently. "There are laws, you know, about decency, about moral character. If enough people make a fuss, the county could—" "Could what?" Tom cut in, his voice like iron. "Make her leave. Put me under arrest for giving a person a job." "I am just laying it out for you," Lyle said. "Frank Mallory has been stirring the pot something fierce. He has got half the town believing you have gone clean off your rocker. And Judge Caldwell has been making inquiries about land deeds and who has residency rights." Tom's hands curled into tight fists. "This is my place, Amos, my land. What I do on it is my own affair." "Normally, I would agree with you," Lyle said. "But when it turns into a question of public morals, the law has a way of getting involved, whether we want it to or not." He stopped for a second, then said in a softer tone, "I am not out here to give you grief, Tom. I am here to warn you. You better watch your back because this town has a mean bite when it wants to use it." He reined his horse around and was gone before Tom could say another word, leaving his warning hanging heavy in the still air. Tom just stood there, his jaw set hard, watching them ride down the dirt road. Then he sensed someone next to him and turned to see Alyssa standing there, a laundry basket propped on her hip. "Trouble?" she asked in a quiet voice. Tom let out a long, slow breath. "It seems we are the local scandal." Alyssa's face did not change one bit. "People will always find something to be scandalized by." "This feels different," Tom said. "They could make real trouble for us, legal trouble." "Let them go ahead and try," Alyssa said, and her voice was pure steel. "I have been judged my whole life, Tom, by people who thought they were better, people who said I was not good enough, not worth the effort, that I should just know my place and keep my mouth shut." She looked him straight in the eye. I did not come all this way just to be run off by a bunch of small-minded men who think their gossip is gospel. Tom looked at her face, saw the fire burning in her eyes, the absolute refusal to give an inch, and it hit him then, something that should have been plain as day from the get-go. Alyssa Morgan was not the type to run from a fight. She was the type to plant her feet and make you prove you had any right to ask her to move. "All right," he said softly. "Then we make our stand." Alyssa smiled, a little thing, but fierce, and completely without fear. Together. The word hung there between them, feeling like a sacred promise, and Tom felt something shift deep inside his chest. Something he had kept locked up tight for 6 long years was starting to crack, letting a little bit of light shine through. He did not know if that was a good thing or a terrible one, but it was happening all the same, ready or not. That evening, Elias showed up with news that made a bad situation a whole lot worse. He rode in hard just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, his face like a thundercloud, and he was off his horse before it had even stopped moving. "We need to have a talk," he said, getting straight to the point. The 3 of them gathered inside the cabin, sitting around the small table while the fire burned low in the fireplace. Elias took a folded piece of paper out of his coat and smoothed it out on the table. "The town council is having a meeting tomorrow night," he said, "and you 2 are the main event." Tom leaned in, his eyes scanning the paper. His name was right there, next to phrases like moral fitness and community standards and land use regulations. "They are making a play for the ranch," Tom stated, his voice flat. "Not quite," Elias corrected. "They are going after the situation. They are using public opinion to try and force you to do what they want. Make you send her away, or you will have to face the consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Alyssa asked. Elias looked her in the eye. "It could be about anything. Fines, court orders, accusations that the property is being used improperly. They will keep digging until they hit on something that will stick." He took a breath. "And if they cannot find anything real, they will just make something up." Tom slapped his hand down hard on the table. "This is plumb crazy. I saved her life 20 years ago. She came back to work off that debt. There is nothing wrong about any of it." "The truth does not matter a bit," Elias said quietly. "The only thing that matters is the story they can get people to believe. And Frank Mallory has been working around the clock, spreading rumors, saying things that would make a decent man sick to his stomach." Alyssa's jaw went tight, but she kept her voice even. "What kind of things?" Elias looked down, clearly not wanting to say the words out loud. Tom answered for him, his own voice raw with fury. "The kind of things that question your character, that suggest you are here for reasons that have got nothing to do with being grateful." Alyssa took that in without even a flinch. "And people are believing him." "Some are," Elias had to admit. "Others are just enjoying the show, but it all leads to the same place. You are both under a microscope now, and every single thing you do is going to be picked apart." Tom got up fast and started pacing over to the window, staring out at the land as it disappeared into the night. His land. The place that he and Sarah had built out of nothing, where they had made plans to grow old. The place where her body now rested under the big cottonwood tree up on the hill. "I will not let them take this from me," he said, his voice low. "And I will not throw her out on the street just because a pack of hypocrites cannot keep their noses in their own business." "Then you have got to be smart about this," Elias warned. "Walking into that meeting without a plan would be a disaster. They will tear you to pieces." Alyssa stood up and went to stand next to Tom by the window. "Then we get a plan. We walk in there and we tell them the plain truth. We do not hide, we do not apologize. We do not give them any more ammunition." "They have already got ammunition," Tom said, the bitterness thick in his voice. Frank made sure of that. "No," Alyssa spoke with a powerful calm. "They are built on lies. We are built on the truth, and the truth carries more weight." Tom watched her, taking in the raw belief shining in her eyes, that deep and total faith that what was right would find its way to the top. He sure wished he could feel that kind of certainty himself. He had been around this town long enough to see that truth and justice did not always walk the same path. But as he looked at Alyssa's determined face, at the way she refused to even think about backing down, something inside him started to stir. It was a feeling he had not felt in many years. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just good old-fashioned stubbornness. He was not sure he could tell the difference anymore. "All right, then," he finally said. "We will go. We will stand right in front of them and make sure they hear every word." Elias gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "I will be there with you, and I will bring along anyone else I can get to stand alongside you." "But why?" Alyssa asked, her voice soft. "This is not your fight." A smile touched Elias's lips, and it looked as ancient and wise as the hills. "My people have a long history of dealing with men who believe they own the very definition of truth. I recognize the look of someone being shoved into a corner just because they do not fit neatly in a box." He turned his gaze to Tom. "You had my back when more than half this town was ready to run me out just for being who I am. It is about time I returned that favor." Tom felt a tightness in his throat. "I surely do appreciate that." After Elias had gone, Tom and Alyssa sat by the fire, a long silence stretching between them. The quiet that settled over them had changed in the past week. It had started out as a stiff and awkward thing, but had slowly turned into something easy, almost like the silence between old friends. At last, Alyssa broke the stillness. "Tell me about Sarah." Tom's breath hitched in his chest. "What was that?" "Your wife," Alyssa said with gentleness. "You never speak of her, but her memory is in every part of this house. It is in the quilts, the pictures on the wall, the very way you move through these rooms as if you feel her absence in every step." She paused for a moment. "I would be honored to know who she was." Tom looked deep into the flames, feeling the pull of old hurts. He had not truly spoken about Sarah, not in any real way, since the day they laid her in the ground. The pain was too sharp. It made the loss feel brand new all over again. Yet there was something in the way Alyssa asked, a genuine warmth in her voice, that made the words feel easier to find than he thought they would be. "She was strong," he said in a low voice. "Not the loud kind of strong. She never felt the need to prove a thing to anybody, but down deep she had a spine made of pure iron that nothing on earth could bend." A small smile touched his face as the memory surfaced. "She reminds me of you in that way." Alyssa's face softened. "How did you two meet?" "At a community barn dance. I was 24, full of more pride than sense, and absolutely convinced I did not need a single soul. She took about 5 minutes to prove just how wrong I was." Tom shook his head slowly. "She saw right past all my defenses, every wall I had ever built, and she simply decided to stay. It did not matter how much I tried to push her away." "Why would you try to push her away?" Tom was quiet for a beat. "Because every person I had ever allowed myself to care for had left me. My folks died when I was 16. A year after that, my brother just vanished. I had learned that loving someone meant you were just setting yourself up to lose them, so I decided to stop trying." "But she changed your mind," Alyssa said. "She certainly did," Tom agreed. "She taught me that being scared of getting hurt does not make you strong. It just makes you awful lonely." His voice grew thick with emotion. "And then she took sick. A fever came on that just would not break. By the time we got the doctor out here, it was already too late. She was gone in 3 days." Alyssa reached across the little space that separated them and laid her hand on top of his. The gesture was simple, with no complications, and it was somehow the exact thing he needed in that moment. "I am so sorry," she said. "Me too," Tom replied. "Every single day." They sat just like that for some time, their hands touching, as the fire burned down to glowing embers and the deep darkness of night settled outside. And Tom came to realize that this was the very first time since Sarah had passed that he had spoken about her without feeling like he was drowning in sorrow. Maybe that was a sign of something changing. Or maybe it just meant he was finally remembering how to breathe again. The following evening, Tom and Alyssa rode into town side by side, with Elias meeting up with them at the start of Main Street. The town hall was already packed to the gills when they walked in. Folks were squeezed onto the benches and standing along the walls, every one of them waiting to see the show. Tom could feel their stares on him as he made his way inside. He heard the whispers spread through the room like a brush fire. Alyssa walked right beside him, her head held high and her face a mask of calm, and Tom drew a little strength from her. He admired the way she simply refused to let their judging looks make her feel small. They found seats in the very first row, and Tom's eyes swept over the crowd. He knew most of the faces there, people he had seen around for years. Some were friendly, most were just neutral, and a handful were looking at him with pure hostility. Frank Mallory was sitting in the back, smiling like a coyote who had just found a henhouse. Judge Thaddeus Caldwell banged his gavel to call the meeting to order, his voice booming through the hall. Caldwell was a man in his 60s who wore his power like a fine suit and took great pleasure in using it. "We are gathered here tonight," Caldwell started, "to address some concerns that the council has received regarding the situation out at the Redern Ranch." Tom's jaw clenched. The word situation made it sound like a mess that needed cleaning up. "Mr. Redford," Caldwell went on, his eyes locked right on Tom, "would you be so kind as to explain to this assembly the exact nature of Miss Morgan's residence on your property?" Tom got to his feet slowly, feeling the weight of every single pair of eyes in that room settle on him. "Alyssa Morgan is living and working on my ranch is because 20 years ago, I pulled her from a flash flood down at Red Creek. She came back to settle that debt, to put in a hard day's work, and to build a life. That is all there is to it." "Absolutely nothing more," Caldwell said again, his voice thick with disbelief. "And yet she is living there under your roof, without a chaperone, in a way that goes against all common decency." Tom's voice got hard. He said, "Common decency would be you minding your own business and letting good people live their lives without you sticking your nose in." A low grumble went through the crowd. Caldwell's eyes got real narrow. "This council has a duty to protect the moral fiber of our town. When that fiber is threatened, we are sworn to act." "Who exactly is threatening it?" Tom shot back. "Frank Mallory, a man who gets drunk and starts fights for fun?" In the back of the room, Frank shot to his feet, his face red with fury. "It is not just me, Redford. Half the folks in this town think you have gone crazy, letting some strange woman move into your dead wife's house." Those words felt like a physical blow. Tom lunged forward with his fists tight, but Alyssa put a hand on his arm and he stopped. She stood up, and the whole room fell silent. "My name is Alyssa Morgan," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. "And I am not a stranger. I am a woman who promised herself 20 years ago that if I made it out alive, if I ever got strong enough, I would return to the place that saved my life and build something meaningful." She scanned the room, looking right into hostile eyes without backing down. "Tom Redford gave me that opportunity. Not because he owed me a single thing, but because he is a good man, the kind of man who does not turn his back on somebody who needs help." "Fine words," Caldwell said, his tone dry, "but they do not change the situation. You are not married. You are living in a man's home without proper oversight. In the eyes of this town and the law, that is a moral failing." "Then maybe your town," Alyssa said softly, "ought to take a good long look at its morals." You could have heard a pin drop. Caldwell's face turned beet red. "How dare you? How dare I speak the truth?" Alyssa cut him off. "How dare I suggest that you are all more worried about how things look than about anyone getting hurt? That you would rather ruin a person's life because it makes you feel uneasy than to consider that maybe, just maybe, your rules are old-fashioned and plain mean." The room just exploded. People started yelling, some agreeing with her, others shouting in anger. Caldwell slammed his gavel, trying to get everyone to quiet down, but it was too late. Tom stood right beside Alyssa, his shoulders squared up with hers, and a powerful sense of pride filled his chest. She was not caving, not letting them push her around. At last, Caldwell got control of the room and gave them both a look that could freeze water. This council will think about what needs to be done. Until then, I strongly advise you both to fix this living arrangement before we have to bring the law into it. The law, Tom said, his voice flat. What do you mean by that? I mean, Caldwell said, that if you keep ignoring our community standards, we might have to take this to the courts. That means fines, legal orders, maybe even challenging your land rights and your fitness to own property. The threat just hung there in the room, thick as smoke. Tom opened his mouth to answer, but Elias stood up first. With all due respect, Judge, I would like to remind this council that Tom Redford has lived on that land for 20 years. He has never been a problem, never broken the law, and he has every right to decide who works on his own property. If you try to run him off his land because of your own private ideas about right and wrong, you're going to have a fight on your hands. Are you threatening me, Mr. Greycloud? Caldwell asked, his voice cold as ice. That is a promise, Elias said, his voice steady, and I will not be the only one standing with him. A woman's voice called out from the middle of the crowd. It was Rosita Delgado, who ran a small boarding house near the edge of town. I have seen how Frank Mallory carries on, the awful things he says to women. If this council is so worried about morals, maybe you should look at him first. Another voice chimed in. And then one more. Folks Tom barely knew were speaking up, trying to push back against all the judgment. But it was not enough, not nearly enough to change the feeling in that room. Caldwell banged his gavel one more time. This meeting is over. The council will meet again in 1 week to announce its decision. Tom felt the pressure of that week-long wait fall on him like a judge's sentence. They walked out into the cool night air, and Tom could feel the whole town's anger aimed at them. He felt their eyes watching, heard their voices whispering, and knew they were being judged with every look they got. When they got back to their horses, Alyssa turned to him. They are going to cause trouble for us. I know, Tom said. And you are still ready to see this through? Tom looked straight into her eyes. I told you, we are in this together. Alyssa gave a slow nod, and in that quiet moment something connected them that was stronger than any words. This was their fight now, whether they had asked for it or not, and neither one of them was going to quit. They rode toward the ranch without talking, but Tom's mind was spinning. Caldwell was not just bluffing. The man had influence, powerful friends, and he was not afraid to use them. If he took this to the courts, Tom could lose it all. The ranch, his home, even the ground where Sarah was buried. But then he looked over at Alyssa riding next to him, her back straight and her eyes looking ahead, and Tom knew something important. He had already lost everything he cared about one time before. When Sarah died, his whole world had fallen apart. He had barely gotten through it. But he did. And now he had a reason to fight again. It was not just about the land anymore, but about what was right. The freedom to live your life your own way. The freedom to help a person in need without being punished for simple kindness. And maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to let himself care about another person again. When they rode up to the ranch, Elias was there waiting for them. 3 other riders Tom knew were with him. Miguel Santos, who worked the ranch next door, Clara Webb, a widow who raised cattle on some land west of town, and Jonas Pine, an old soldier who had settled down in the area after the war. Figured you could use some company, Elias said in a low voice. Tom felt a lump form in his throat. You all do not have to get involved in this. Yes, we do, Clara said, her voice firm. We have all seen what happens when decent folks just stand by and say nothing. It never ends well. They sat with them all night until the sun came up, just keeping watch, making sure nobody tried to pull anything in the dark. And when the sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the canyon with streaks of gold and red, Tom stood on his porch and looked at the few people who had come to stand by his side. It was not many, but it was enough. It was enough to know he was not fighting this alone. Enough to know that some things in this world were still worth the fight. Alyssa came and stood next to him with a cup of coffee, and they watched the morning come in together. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, "thank you for not backing down." Tom looked at her, and he could see the tiredness in her face, the worry she was working so hard to hide, and he felt something inside his chest begin to thaw. Something that had been frozen solid for 6 long years. "I should be the one thanking you," he said, "for reminding me what it is like to have something worth fighting for." Alyssa gave him a small smile, and for just a second, the world did not seem so heavy. Then the sound of horses' hooves broke the peace. Tom turned his head and saw a group of riders coming up the road fast, 5 of them, spread out and riding with a purpose. He knew who they were even from a distance. Frank Malary and his bunch. "Get in the house," Tom said to Alyssa. "No," she answered, her voice solid as a rock. "Alyssa, I said no." She put her coffee cup down and did not budge an inch. "Whatever is about to happen, we will face it together." Tom wanted to tell her to listen, wanted to keep her safe, but he saw the determination in her eyes and knew it was no use. Elias and the others moved to stand beside them, their hands resting near their rifles, ready for anything but not looking for a fight. The riders pulled their horses to a stop about 20 feet from the porch. Frank sat in the middle of them, grinning like a coyote. "Morning, Tom," Frank said slowly. "That is a nice little party you have got going on here." "What do you want, Frank?" Frank's grin got wider. "I just came to bring you a message from some worried folks in town. You see, we have been talking it over and we figure maybe you need a little push to do the right thing." "The right thing," Tom repeated, his voice empty of emotion. "Send the woman away," Frank said, "before this all gets real ugly." "Is that a threat?" "Just some friendly advice." Frank's eyes had a cruel spark in them. "But if you are too hard-headed to listen, well, accidents can happen. Fires start, fences get cut, cattle just disappear." He let that hang in the air. "It would be a real shame if something bad happened to this nice little ranch of yours." Tom felt a hot rage start to boil up inside him, his chest hot and sharp. But before a word could come out of his mouth, Alyssa took a step forward. "Do you actually think you can frighten us away?" she asked, her voice even but carrying a deadly edge. "Do you believe your threats and your attempts to bully us will make us turn and run?" Frank's eyes slid over to her, and his grin twisted into something foul. "I think you are a fool, sweetheart, if you believe for one second that you have any say in this at all." "Do not call her that," Tom said, his voice low and full of warning. Frank just laughed. "Or what? Are you going to hit me again? Go right ahead. Give me a reason." The air grew so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Tom's hand drifted down toward his rifle. Frank's men shifted in their saddles, their own hands moving toward their guns. And then Elias spoke, his voice calm and clear as a bell. "If you boys have any sense, you will turn those horses around and ride away. Because if the shooting starts, you are not going to be the only ones with something to lose." Frank's eyes narrowed to slits. "Is that a threat, Gray Cloud?" "I am just stating the facts," Elias said, his tone perfectly level. "You came here with 5 men against our 6, and we are standing on our own ground. Are you really sure you want to test those numbers?" For a long, heavy moment, not a soul moved. The morning air was thick with the possibility of violence. Then Frank spat on the ground and gave a hard yank on his horse's reins. "This is not over." "I never figured it was," Tom said. The riders wheeled their horses around and galloped off, leaving behind a cloud of dust and a promise of future trouble hanging in the air. Tom just stood there, his heart pounding and his hands clenched into fists until they were completely out of sight. Then he turned to Alyssa and noticed her hands were trembling. "Are you all right?" he asked her softly. Alyssa nodded, but her voice was strained. "They are really going to do it. They are going to try to tear this place apart." "Let them try," Tom said. "We will be ready for them." But even as the words left his mouth, Tom felt the crushing weight of what was coming settle over him like a burial shroud. This was not just about his reputation any longer. It was not just about legal papers and the town turning against him. This was turning into a war, and wars always leave behind casualties. The war that Frank had promised arrived even quicker than Tom had braced himself for. That very night, flames started to crawl up the fence of the eastern corral. It was not a wildfire. This was too neat, too planned. Someone had set it on purpose, picking a spot far enough from the house to go unnoticed at first, but close enough to deliver a clear message. Tom and Alyssa spotted the orange glow through the cabin window and took off running, carrying buckets, their hearts hammering against their ribs. By the time they managed to beat the fire into submission, half the fence was nothing but black ash, and the heavy smell of burnt wood filled the night air. Elias and Miguel stayed over after that, taking turns standing watch with rifles resting on their laps. Not much was said between them. Nothing needed to be. Every one of them understood what this meant. The polite stage of the fight was officially over. 2 nights after that, the crack of gunshots split the darkness. 3 rounds were fired from somewhere up in the hills, close enough to shatter a window in the barn, but far enough away that shooting back would be a waste of bullets. Tom snatched his rifle and ran outside, his eyes scanning the ridgeline, but he saw nothing but dark shadows and the cold light of the stars. Whoever had fired the shots was long gone. Alyssa came up beside him, breathing heavily, her face looking pale in the moonlight. Are they trying to kill us, or are they just trying to scare us? Scare us, Tom said with a grim certainty. If they wanted us dead, we would be dead. This is all about trying to break our spirit. It will not work, Alyssa said, and her voice was filled with iron. Tom believed her, but he also understood that being afraid and being brave were not 2 different things. You could be scared to death and still find it in you to refuse to run. He could see it in the way Alyssa's hands shook when she thought he was not looking. He saw it in the way she jumped at any sudden noise and in the dark circles that were starting to form under her eyes, from too many nights spent listening for footsteps that were never going to come. She was afraid. They both were. But they did not leave. In the daytime, the work itself became an act of defiance. Tom fixed what had been broken, he rebuilt what had been burned, and he kept that ranch going just like always, as if to say nothing had changed. Alyssa worked right alongside him, her movements filled with a grim determination, showing them all again and again that she would not be run off by threats or violence. But the trouble did not stop. Fence lines were cut in the dead of night. The cattle were scattered clear across the canyon, making Tom and Elias spend 2 whole days just rounding them all up. A water trough was poisoned, not with enough to kill the livestock, but just enough to make them sick, and to make it clear that nothing on that ranch was safe. And through it all, the town just watched. Some of them felt sorry for him, but never said a word, while others seemed pleased, but did not bother to hide it. And Judge Caldwell said nothing. He just let the trouble do his talking for him. On the 5th night after that meeting, Tom was sitting on his porch cleaning his rifle, on edge about every little shadow, every single sound. Alyssa came out and sat down next to him with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders to ward off the desert chill. "We cannot keep on this way," she said, her voice quiet. Tom's hands stopped their work on the rifle. "Are you wanting to leave?" "No," Alyssa said without a second's hesitation. "I want to take the fight to them." Tom gave her a sharp look. "Fight them how?" "By making them look at what they are doing," Alyssa said. "Right now they are hiding in the shadows, acting like they are in the right while they tear this place apart. We need to drag them out into the daylight, make it so the town cannot pretend not to see." "And just how are we supposed to do that?" Alyssa's eyes were like hard stones. "We are going right back to that council. We are going to force them to listen. We make them see what is happening and we make them pick a side. Stand with what is right or stand with the cowards." Tom just shook his head, slow-like. "Caldwell is not going to listen. His mind is already made up." "Then we do not talk to Caldwell," Alyssa said. "We talk to the townspeople. The ones who stood by us at that meeting, the ones who have been quiet but on our side. We give them a real reason to find their voice. Tom wanted to say it was no use, that folks do not change, that they do not suddenly find a backbone when it counts. But looking at her face, at that fierce look in her eyes, he found himself wanting to believe her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Alyssa leaned in, and in the warm light from the cabin's fireplace, Tom saw the sharp mind of a fighter under that rancher's hat. "We gather proof, write down every single attack, and get statements from anybody willing to give one. Then we lay it all out at the next town council meeting, not as poor folks begging for help, but as citizens who demand to be heard." "They will just deny it," Tom said. "They will say we cannot prove who did it." "Maybe," Alyssa answered. "But it is a lot harder to deny something when the proof is staring you right in the face, and even harder when the whole town is there watching." Tom thought it over, turning the idea around in his mind. It was a big gamble. It could blow up in their faces something awful, but doing nothing was like slowly bleeding out, just waiting for the next hit. "All right," he said at last. "We will do it your way." Alyssa's shoulders dropped just a bit, and Tom knew she had been ready for a fight. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," Tom told her. "This could stir up the hornet's nest before things get any better." "I know," Alyssa said, "but at least we will be fighting back." The very next morning, they got to work collecting their proof. Tom took pictures of the burnt fence posts, the busted window in the barn, and the snipped wire. Alyssa wrote down all the dates, times, and details in a leather-bound book with handwriting so neat it looked like something a lawyer would write. Elias rode out to the neighboring ranches, asking questions on the quiet, trying to see who might be willing to speak up. Rosita Delgado was the first one to step forward. She showed up at the ranch 3 days later, her face set like stone. "I heard Frank and his boys talking," she said. She was sitting at Tom's kitchen table with a cup of coffee she never touched. "Over at the saloon, they were bragging about what they did to your fence, laughing about it like it was some big joke." "And you would be willing to say that in public?" Tom asked. Rosita thought for a moment. "Rosita." You could see the fear in her eyes. But then she sat up a little straighter. "Yes. I have seen men like Frank push people around this town for far too long. It is high time somebody stood up to them. After her, others came." Miguel Santos swore he saw riders near Tom's land on the night of the fire. Clara Webb confessed she overheard Judge Caldwell and Frank talking about how to handle the red fern problem while they were eating dinner at the hotel. Jonas Pine, an old fellow who had seen real fighting at Shiloh, looked Tom square in the eye and said, "What they are doing out here is nothing but cowardice trying to pass itself off as strength." Every statement they got felt like a small win. Every name they wrote down felt like another friend arriving to help hold the line. But then the trouble got worse. It happened on a dark, moonless night, about 10 days after Frank had made his threat. Tom woke up to the sound of horses. Too many horses, and the voices yelling out there in the dark. He grabbed his rifle and ran out onto the porch to see the yard swarming with riders. Maybe 8 or 9 of them. They had bandanas covering their faces and were holding fiery torches high. "Get off my property!" Tom yelled, lifting his rifle. One of the riders let out a laugh, a sound Tom knew, even with the cloth over his mouth. Frank Mallory. "You had your warning, Redfern. Your time is up." They spurred their horses and charged the house. Tom fired one shot, then another, aiming high above their heads. They were warning shots, meant to scare them off, but they did not stop. One rider broke off and headed for the barn. Another galloped toward the horse corral. A third rode right for the cabin, pulling his arm back to throw his torch. Just then, Alyssa was right there beside Tom, her own rifle up and ready. She fired. The shot hit the torch clean out of the rider's hand. It spun through the air and landed in the dirt, where it fizzled out. The riders pulled their horses to a sudden stop, surprised to find a real fight on their hands. "The next one will not be a warning," Alyssa shouted. From the barn, the crack of Elias's rifle echoed. Miguel came running from the bunkhouse. All of a sudden, the riders found they were outnumbered, surrounded, and looking down the barrels of guns held by folks who knew exactly how to use them. Frank's voice cut through the noise. "Pull back!" The riders turned their horses and scattered, vanishing into the night like the cowards they were. But as they rode off, Frank's voice drifted back across the canyon. "You cannot be everywhere at once, Redfern. We will be back." Tom just stood there, his rifle still up, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his own ears. Next to him, Alyssa was shaking, not from being scared, but from the rush of it all and plain old anger. "They tried to burn us out of our home," she said, her voice tight. "They really tried to burn us out, and they failed," Tom said. "But Frank is right. We cannot watch everything all the time. We cannot stay on guard day and night forever." Elias walked up to them on the porch, his face serious. "This has gone past messing around. This was an attempt to kill someone. You have to go see Sheriff Lyle." Tom let out a bitter laugh. "Lyle is not going to do a thing. He is too scared of Caldwell." "Then we make him do something," Elias said. "You have got people willing to talk now. You have got proof. Make it so he has no choice but to listen." Tom knew Elias was right, but he also knew that going to Lyle was like admitting they could not handle this on their own. It meant asking for help from the same law that had already turned its back on them. But still, what other choice did they have? The next morning, Tom and Alyssa rode into town carrying a folder filled with written statements and photographs. They found Sheriff Lyle in his office with his feet propped up on his desk, reading the newspaper like it was just another peaceful day. "Tom," Lyle said, putting down the paper, "what can I do for you?" Tom slapped the folder down on the desk hard enough to make Lyle jump. "This is proof of arson, vandalism, and attempted murder. All of it done against my property in the last 2 weeks." Lyle opened the folder slowly. He looked through the papers, and his face got more and more troubled with every page he turned. At last, he closed it and looked up. "This is mighty serious," he said. "It sure is," Tom agreed. "So, what are you planning to do about it?" Lyle shifted in his seat. "I will look into it." "That is not good enough," Alyssa said, her voice sharp. "We have got witnesses. We have got dates and times. We are giving you everything you need to go out there and make some arrests." "It is not that simple," Lyle said. "Most of this proof is just what people think happened. Nobody actually saw Frank or his men doing any of these things." "Rosita Delgado heard them admitting to it," Tom said. "Heard them talking about it," Lyle corrected him. "That is not the same as a real confession. And even if it was, do you have any idea how tough it is to win a case in court with second-hand talk, especially when you are up against men who have friends in high places in this town?" Tom's hands balled up into tight fists. "So what you are saying is, you are not going to do anything." "I am saying," Lyle said, choosing his words with care, "that trying to handle this through the law would be an uphill battle and you probably would not win. But there are other ways to solve this." "Like what?" Alyssa demanded. Lyle looked her right in the eye. "Like maybe you reconsider where you are living. If you were to leave on your own, all this trouble would just stop." Problem solved. The silence in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Tom felt a hot anger rising up in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "You are telling us to give up, to let a bunch of bullies run us off our own land because it is easier than you doing your job." "I am telling you to be smart about this," Lyle said. "This whole situation is a powder keg. You are both in real danger, and the longer you stick around, the worse it is going to get." Alyssa stood up so fast her chair scraped the floor. "Then I guess it is up to us to solve it ourselves." She walked out before Tom could say another word. He snatched the folder off the desk and went after her, leaving Lyle sitting there looking mighty relieved to see them go. Outside, Alyssa was pacing back and forth next to their horses, so angry you could almost feel the heat coming off of her. "He is not going to help us." "No," Tom agreed. "He sure is not." "So, what is our next move?" Tom thought about it for a minute. He thought about all the proof they had gathered. He thought about the good people who had found the courage to speak up, And he thought about the town council meeting that was scheduled for the next night. "We do what you said we should do," he told her. "We take this right to the people, and we make them choose a side." That evening, Tom and Alyssa sat at their kitchen table, getting ready for their fight. Alyssa wrote everything down in her neat handwriting, putting the facts in order, building their case like a big city lawyer getting ready for a trial. Tom sorted through the pictures, the witness statements, and the actual proof of everything that had been done to them. "You are pretty good at this," Tom said, watching her work. Alyssa looked up from her paper. "At what?" "Planning, figuring things out. You think like somebody who has been in a few fights before." Alyssa put her pen down. "I have been. Just not the kind with guns." She got real still for a bit, then went on. "Said after my mama passed, my daddy just fell apart. We ended up losing the house. Had to take a room in a boarding house. And the fellow who owned it had ideas about how rent could be paid, and it did not involve money." Her voice was just flat, like she was talking about the weather. "I was 14. I got smart real quick about writing things down, about gathering proof, about making sure men paid for what they did when they figured no one was watching." Tom felt a tightness in his chest. "What did you do?" "I turned him into the county with a list of dates, times, and folks who saw. He got 6 months in jail." Alyssa's eyes looked like hard stones. "It was not nearly enough, but it was something. And it taught me the only way to deal with folks who like the dark is to drag them kicking and screaming into the sun." Tom laid his hand over hers on the table. "I am so sorry that happened to you." Alyssa glanced down at their hands, then back up at him. "Do not be. It made me into the woman I am today, and I am not one to break." They just sat that way for a time, a silent understanding passing between them. Then Alyssa gently pulled her hand away and went back to her writing. And Tom just watched her, feeling something he had not felt in 6 long years. It was not just respect or admiration, but something deeper. It was a feeling that scared him half to death because it felt an awful lot like hope. The very next evening, they walked into the town hall, and it was even more packed than before. News about what they were aiming to do had gotten around, and folks came out to watch the fireworks. Tom saw Frank over in the back smirking like it was all some big show. Judge Caldwell was at the council table, his cronies on either side, looking as smug and sure of himself as a fox in a henhouse. Tom and Alyssa found their seats. Elias sat right behind them, a quiet wall of support. Rosita was there, and so were Miguel, Clara, and Jonas. They were a small band of friends in a room full of unfriendly faces. Caldwell banged his gavel to start the meeting. "We are here to make our final ruling on the trouble out at Redern Ranch. But before we do, I am told Mr. Redern has something he would like to show us." Tom got to his feet, holding the folder. "I surely do. It is evidence of a planned campaign of violence and threats meant to run Miss Morgan and me right off my own land." A low rumble went through the crowd. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "That is a mighty serious thing to say." "It is a documented fact," Tom said. He started laying out the photographs on the table for the council to see. The scorched fence line, the busted window, the snipped wire. Each picture was a stark and silent witness. Then Alyssa stood up and started to read from her journal. October 15th, 2 in the morning, a fire was set at the east fence. October 17th, 10 at night, 3 shots were fired from up on the north ridge. October 19th, a gunshot shattered the barn window. October 21st, the cattle were run off and the water trough was poisoned. Her voice was steady like a doctor reading a report. And 4 nights ago, around midnight, 9 riders came and tried to burn the cabin down with us asleep inside. You could have heard a pin drop in that room. Caldwell was the first to find his tongue. Awful business if it is true. But what proof do you have that anyone from this town had a hand in it? "We have got folks who saw it happen," Tom said, and he nodded toward Rosita. Rosita stood up, shaking a little, but with a firm set to her jaw. "I heard Frank Mallory and his boys down at the saloon. They were carrying on about burning Tom's fence, laughing about it like it was a big joke. Frank jumped up from his chair. That is a flat-out lie. Is it now? Clara Webb said, standing too. Because I heard you and Judge Caldwell at the hotel 2 weeks back talking about how to settle the Redern situation. The judge's face turned beet red. That talk was not what you think it was. And I suppose it was not what Miguel Santos thought when he saw riders near Tom's place on the night of the fire, Elias said as he stood. Or when Jonas Pine saw for himself the fence being cut along the western edge. The councilmen started fidgeting in their chairs. The crowd was murmuring so loud that Caldwell had to hammer his gavel. Order! This is all just gossip and guessing. It is sworn testimony, Alyssa said, her voice sharp as broken glass. From good people who have got nothing to gain and their whole lives to lose just by standing up. Folks who are taking a huge risk by even being here tonight. That is not a guess. That is courage. Caldwell's jaw was working hard. Even if, and I want to be clear, if any of this has a grain of truth, it does not change the real problem. Miss Morgan's living on Mr. Redern's land is still improper. The fix is easy. She goes, and the trouble goes with her. The fix, Tom said, his voice low and dangerous, is for you to do your job and go after the people breaking the law instead of pointing fingers at the ones being wronged. I will not be told how to do my job by a man who... By a man who what? Tom cut him off. A man who gave a person a place to work? A man who paid back a 20-year-old debt? What exactly is my crime here, Judge? Caldwell shot to his feet, his face all flushed and angry. Your crime is bringing this mess into our town. Your crime is ignoring basic decency. Your crime is being an inconvenience, Alyssa finished for him in a quiet voice. That is what this is all about, is it not? It is not about right or wrong or even the law. It is just about power. The power to shove people into little boxes where you want them. The power to hurt anyone who dares to step out of line. The whole room just blew up. People were yelling, some on their side, some hollering for quiet. And right in the middle of it all, Tom saw Frank Mallory get up and start easing his way to the door, planning to slip out before things got any hotter for him. Going somewhere, Frank? Elias's voice boomed out. Frank stopped dead and turned around. I do not have to stay here and listen to this trash. No, Elias said, agreeing with him. But you are gonna, because for the first time in your sorry life, you're going to face up to what you have done. Frank's hand twitched down toward his belt. Tom saw it and got ready, but before anybody could pull a weapon, Sheriff Lyle stood up from where he had been sitting in the back. That is enough, Lyle said, and his voice cut right through the racket. Frank, you sit your tail back down, or I will haul you in for disturbing the peace. Frank just stared at the sheriff, completely stunned. You are siding with them? I am siding with the law, Lyle said, which is something you have been breaking left and right, and I have got a whole folder of proof that says so. Tom felt like the air had been knocked out of him. Lyle was finally doing something, finally being the sheriff. But Caldwell was not giving up. Sheriff, you are way out of line. No, Judge, Lyle said. For too long I have been under my line, letting town politics get in the way of my duty. But that is over now. He looked straight at Tom. I went through your evidence. It is solid. And when you put it with what I have seen with my own 2 eyes, I have got more than enough reason to open an investigation on Frank Mallory and anyone else who took part in these attacks. The room went stone quiet. Frank's face went from white to a deep, angry purple. This is a setup. You cannot do this. I can, Lyle said, and I will. Now sit down before I add resisting arrest to the list. Frank looked all around the room, desperate for an ally, but found nobody. Even Caldwell had clammed up. You could see him thinking hard on his next move. At last, Frank slumped back into his chair. But the look he shot at Tom and Alyssa was a promise that this was far from over. Caldwell cleared his throat. This council is going to need some time to look over these new developments. We will meet again. No, Tom said. We are not leaving this hanging. You wanted a decision on whether Alyssa could stay. Well, here it is. She is staying on my ranch, which I own free and clear. If you or anybody else has a legal objection to that, you can take it to a real court. But you will not use threats and violence to bully us into doing what you want." Caldwell's eyes were like ice. "Mr. Redern, you are in contempt of this council. Good, because this council has contempt for what is right." Tom snatched the folder off the table and turned to go. "Come on, Alyssa. We are finished here." They walked out of that hall, and this time, about half the room got up and followed them. Rosita, Miguel, Clara, Jonas, Elias, and a good dozen more who had been silent before, but had finally found their nerve. Out under the big night sky, Tom felt some of that heavy weight lift off his shoulders. They had not won, not all the way. But they had stood their ground, and they showed everyone they would not be broken. Alyssa looked up at him, her eyes shining in the dark. "What do we do now?" Tom thought about the pure rage on Frank's face, about Caldwell's fury, and about the fight he knew was still on its way. "Now," he said, "we go home, and we get ready for whatever is coming next." Because he knew for a fact Frank would not take this laying down. He knew that kind of shame only leads to more violence. He knew the worst of it was probably still ahead, but for the first time since it all began, Tom felt like they might just make it through. Tom was wrong about one thing, though. The worst was not planning to wait. They rode back toward the ranch as a group. Elias, Miguel, Jonas, and Clara acted as a sort of guard around Tom and Alyssa. Nobody said much. The fire from the meeting was dying down, and all that was left was a deep-down weariness. But there was, and they had left with their dignity. And they had left with their dignity intact. That ought to have felt right. Tom surely wanted it to feel right, but a knot had tightened in his stomach. It was the kind of dread you get from knowing that fellas like Frank Mallory do not handle being shamed. They get even. When they got back to the ranch, Tom made it clear that nobody was to leave for the night. Not until they were sure Frank was not cooking up something foolish. No one put up a fight. They got a fire going in the yard and split the watch duties while the rest of them tried to get some sleep. Tom took a seat on the porch steps with his rifle resting on his lap. He stared into the pitch black and just listened to the sounds the canyon makes at night. Out there in the dark, Frank was licking his wounds and figuring out his payback. Tom could feel it deep in his bones. Alyssa came out close to midnight and sat down next to him. She brought a cup of coffee that sent steam up into the chilly air. "You need to get some sleep," Tom told her. "So do you." "I cannot." Tom accepted the coffee with a thankful nod. Too keyed up. "I just keep running through what Frank might try to pull." Alyssa was silent for a spell before she asked, "Do you reckon we came on too strong?" Tom thought about it for a second. "No, I figure we did exactly what had to be done. But that does not mean it will not come back on us." "It always comes back on you," Alyssa said. "The only question is if the trouble is worth it." Tom looked at the shape of her face in the starlight and saw the backbone she had, that stubborn refusal to regret doing the right thing. "Do you really believe that?" "I have to," Alyssa said plainly. "If not, what is the whole point of putting up a fight?" Tom gave a slow nod as the understanding settled in his soul. She was right. Being afraid of what might happen was just another way of quitting, and they were too far down this road to quit now. They sat there in a comfortable quiet, their shoulders just barely touching, sharing a bit of warmth against the high desert chill. And Tom started thinking of Sarah again. But it was different this time. It was not with that heavy, crushing sense of loss, but with something softer. Maybe it was gratitude. For the years they had, for the things she taught him about not backing down. Sarah would have liked Alyssa, he thought to himself. She would have seen that same steel in her spine, that same refusal to bend. The thought brought a dull ache to his chest, but it was not enough to break him, and that felt like a step forward. The sun came up gray and cold, painting the whole canyon in shades of dust and ash. Tom stood up and stretched, feeling every joint complain, and he scanned the horizon. Nothing was moving out there but some scrub brush tumbling in the wind. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe Frank was shrewder than he gave him credit for. That is when the explosion rolled in from the direction of town. It was not close, but it was loud enough to travel across miles of empty land. It was a deep, heavy boom that shook the windows and sent birds scattering into the sky. In a flash, everyone was up on their feet, guns in hand, looking for whatever was coming. "What in the hell was that?" Miguel yelled. A chill went down Tom's spine. Town. They got the horses saddled in a hurry and rode out fast, leaving Clara behind to keep an eye on the ranch. The nearer they got to Mesa Ridge, the more smoke Tom could make out, a thick black pillar climbing into the morning sky. When they came over the ridge that overlooked the town, Tom reined his horse to a halt, and his stomach just dropped. The courthouse was on fire. Not the entire building, not yet, but the whole western section where the council held their meetings. Flames were just pouring out of the busted windows while folks ran around with buckets, trying like mad to beat back the fire. "Sweet Lord have mercy," Elias breathed. They spurred their horses down into town, joining the bucket brigade without being asked. Tom worked like a machine, hauling water and tossing it at flames that just seemed to laugh back at them. Right there with him, Alyssa did the same, her face streaked with black soot and sweat. It took a long 2 hours before they finally beat the fire back. By that time, half the courthouse was gone. The council chambers were nothing but blackened timber and gray ash. Sheriff Lyle stood among the ruins, his face a grim mask as he poked through what was left. When he spotted Tom, he waved him over. "Arson," Lyle said, plain and simple. "Somebody set this fire on purpose. You can smell the kerosene." Tom's jaw went tight. "Frank?" "Probably," Lyle admitted. "But I do not have a lick of proof." "Not yet." The sheriff looked at Tom with something that was almost an apology. "This is payback for last night, for you standing up to him, and for me finally doing my job. So, what are you going to do about it?" Lyle's expression turned hard as iron. "I am going to do my job, starting with finding Frank Mallory and hauling him in for a long talk." But Frank was gone. His house was empty, his horse wasn't in the stable, and none of his usual drinking buddies would say they had seen him. It was like he had just melted into the desert, leaving a trail of destruction behind him. Judge Caldwell showed up in the town square about noon. He had 2 county officials Tom had never seen before flanking him. The judge's face was tight with anger, and when he saw Tom, that anger found its target. "This is your fault," Caldwell said, his voice trembling. "Your defiance, your refusal to bow to proper authority. You are the one who pushed Frank too far." Tom felt a hot rage building inside him, but kept his voice steady. "I pushed him? Frank has been running roughshod over my property for weeks, and you did nothing. This fire is on his hands and on the hands of every person who let him get away with it." "Frank is just a symptom," Caldwell snapped back. "You are the sickness. If you had just done what you were told, if you had just done your job," Alyssa cut in, stepping right up to him, "and held Frank accountable in the first place, none of this would have happened. You do not get to blame us for the results of your own cowardice." One of the county men, a skinny fella in a suit that looked way too fancy for Mesa Ridge, cleared his throat. "I am District Attorney Marcus Hoot, and I am afraid Judge Caldwell is right about one thing. This whole situation has gotten completely out of hand." He gave Tom a cold, measuring look. "We are putting some emergency measures into place." "What kind of measures?" Tom demanded. Hoot pulled a folded document from inside his coat. "An injunction. It takes effect immediately. It cites concerns for public safety and the ongoing civil unrest. The county is freezing all property sales and any changes to residency in Mesa Ridge until we can conduct a full investigation." Tom just stared at him. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means," Hewitt said, "that Miss Morgan's living on your property is now legally questionable. Until this whole mess is settled, she cannot be considered a lawful resident or an employee of the Red Fern Ranch." The words hit Tom like a punch to the gut. He felt Alyssa stiffen beside him. "You cannot do that," Tom said, his voice low. "We just did," Hewitt replied. "What is more, with the courthouse destroyed and all this violence, we are placing the ranch under county oversight. Any attempt to resist or get around this order will lead to legal action, which could include the seizure of your property." The edges of Tom's vision started to turn red. "You are using Frank's crimes as an excuse to steal my land. We are using emergency powers to bring back order," Whit said, his voice smooth as silk. "If you comply and cooperate, we can get this all sorted out quickly. If you resist—" He let the threat just hang there in the air. Caldwell stepped forward, and Tom could see the satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. "The law has spoken, Mr. Redfern. I suggest you listen to it." Tom looked at the paper Hoot was holding, seeing his entire world boil down to legal words and official stamps. He saw everything he and Sarah had built being ripped away by men in suits who had never done a hard day's work on the land in their lives. "When?" was all he could manage to ask. "The injunction is in effect right now," Hewitt said. "You have 24 hours to show you are complying. That means Miss Morgan needs to be off the premises. Any attempt to let her stay after that deadline will be a violation." Alyssa's hand found Tom's arm, and she squeezed it tight. He looked down at her and saw a war between fury and fear in her eyes. "We will fight this," she said softly. "True." "In court," Hewitt said, "which is where these things belong. But until then, the order stands." They rode back to the ranch without saying a word, the silence thick and heavy. Elias and Miguel rode behind them, looking just as stunned. When they got back to the property, Clara was waiting for them. The looks on their faces told her everything she needed to know. "How bad is it?" she asked. "Bad?" Tom said. He laid out the whole ugly story. The injunction, the challenge to Alyssa's residency, the threat of them seizing the ranch. With every word he spoke, the situation felt more real, more impossible. When he was done, Clara let out a string of curse words that was long and creative. "They are using the law as a weapon." "They have been doing that since the beginning," Alyssa said, her voice bitter. "This is just them taking it to the next level." Tom stood in his own yard, looking out at the land he had poured his entire life into, and felt something crack deep inside him. He was not breaking, not yet, but he was fractured. How in the world do you fight a system that is designed to grind you into dust? How do you stand up against men who swing the law around like a club? "We need a lawyer," Elias said. "Somebody who knows how to fight this kind of war." "With what money?" Tom asked. "I have got enough to keep the ranch going, but probably not enough to take on a whole team of county lawyers." "Then we find another way," Alyssa said. She turned to Tom, her eyes burning with intensity. "We are not giving up. Not after everything we have been through." "What choice do we have?" Tom asked, and he hated how defeated he sounded. "They are using the law. We cannot just pretend it does not exist." "No," Alyssa agreed, "but we can shine a light on it. We can make people see what they are really up to." Tom shook his head. This town just watched half its courthouse burn to the ground. They are scared. They are mad. They are looking for somebody to blame. And Caldwell just served us up to them on a silver platter. "Then we remind them who really set that fire," Alyssa insisted. "We find Frank. We prove he did it, and we make it impossible for Caldwell and Hewitt to hide behind their legal games." It was a long shot, and Tom knew it. But looking at Alyssa's face, at her absolute refusal to surrender, he felt that crack in his chest start to mend. "All right," he said. "We find Frank, but we are running out of time." They had even less time than Tom realized. That afternoon, 3 men from the county office showed up with paperwork and clipboards. They were there to do what they called an assessment of the property. Tom watched them as they measured, took pictures, and wrote down notes on everything. And a growing feeling of being violated crept over him. They were not just evaluating the ranch. They were taking inventory before they seized it. One of them, a clerk with thinning hair and shaky hands, pulled Tom aside. "Look, I am just doing my job here," he said quietly, "but you ought to know. There is talk down at the county office. They are planning to auction this place off if you do not fall in line." Tom's hands balled into fists. "Auction it to who?" The clerk looked around nervously. "The word is, there is already a buyer lined up, somebody with close ties to Judge Caldwell." Tom felt a wave of sickness wash over him. This was never about doing the right thing or upholding the law. It had been about greed from the very start. It was about powerful men wanting land they did not own and twisting the system to steal it. When the assessors finally packed up and left, Tom sat down on his porch steps and dropped his head into his hands. The whole situation felt impossible. Frank was in the wind. The law was being used against them, and they had less than 18 hours before Alyssa would legally have to leave. Alyssa came and sat down next to him. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Finally, she broke the silence. "I could go." Tom's head shot up. "What?" "I could leave," Alyssa said softly. "I could do what their order says. Take myself out of the picture so they do not have an excuse to destroy you." "No," Tom said without a second's hesitation. "Tom, if I am gone, they do not have any grounds to stand on." "They will just find other grounds," Tom interrupted. "This is not about you anymore. It is about the land. They want it, and they will use any excuse they can find to take it." He turned to look her straight in the eye. "You leaving does not solve a single thing. It just means they win." Alyssa's eyes searched his face. "And what if they take the ranch anyway? What if fighting them costs you everything?" Tom thought about that. He thought about the land, about Sarah's grave up on the hill, and about the life he had built here. And then he thought about what that life had become in the 6 years since Sarah had passed. It was empty, quiet, a slow death from loneliness. "I would rather lose it all fighting for something that matters," he said, "than keep something that I am just holding on to for the wrong reasons." Alyssa's breathing caught in her throat. "What are the right reasons?" Tom met her eyes and held them. "The principle. The idea that folks ought to be able to live their lives without getting trampled by men who believe their power gives them the right to say what is and is not proper." Something in Alyssa's face changed. It was a look that was soft and delicate, and so full of a terrifying hope. "Tom." A gunshot echoed through the canyon, completely shattering the quiet moment. Tom and Alyssa hit the dirt as 2 more shots rang out, kicking up dust around the yard. Tom grabbed his rifle and searched the ridgeline, catching a glint of muzzle flash from behind a mess of rocks about 200 yards away. "Get in the house," he hollered at Alyssa. But she was already on the move, her own rifle ready, finding cover behind the water trough. Elias came out of the barn and started firing back. Miguel sprinted from the bunkhouse, his weapon up. The shots just kept on coming, pinning them all down and forcing them to stay low. Tom figured there were at least 3 shooters, possibly more. They were all set up on the high ground with a perfect view. "Frank!" Elias yelled. "It has to be!" Tom returned fire, but trying to hit anything at that distance with a rifle was next to impossible. And the shooters knew it. They were not trying to hit them. They were just keeping Tom and his friends pinned down, trying to wear them out and make them waste their ammunition. The whole attack lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Then, just as quick as it began, the gunfire stopped. Tom held his breath, waiting, listening. There was nothing. At last, he chanced a peek over the porch railing. The ridge was clear. The shooters had vanished, but they had left a little something behind. Elias was the one who found it when he rode up to scout their position. It was a note, pinned to a flat rock with a hunting knife. He brought it back down to Tom, his face set like stone, grim. Tom carefully unfolded the piece of paper and read the messy scrawl of Frank's handwriting. "You cannot watch everything. You cannot protect everyone. The clock is ticking." A deep cold settled in Tom's gut. This was not just a simple threat. It was a promise. Frank was going to keep coming. He would keep attacking and keep pushing things further until somebody or something finally broke. That night, they turned the ranch into a fortress, or the best version of one they could manage. Elias, Miguel, and Jonas set up watch around the edges of the property. Clara stayed inside the house with Alyssa. Both of them were armed and ready. Tom moved from one spot to the next, checking angles and making sure every single person had enough ammunition. But he knew deep down that this was not a real solution. They could not live like they were under siege forever. They could not stay this wound up for long. Something was bound to snap. Sometime around midnight, Alyssa found him checking the locks on the barn and pulled him over to the side. "We need to talk," she said. Tom followed her into the tack room, away from everyone else. She shut the door and then turned to face him. In the dim light of the lantern, Tom could see both the sheer exhaustion and the fierce determination in her eyes. "I have been thinking," Alyssa started, "about all of this that has happened. The injunction, the attacks, the way they are twisting the law to corner us." "And?" Tom prompted. "And I think there is one thing they will never see coming." Alyssa took a long, steady breath. "We get married." Tom just stared at her, completely sure he had heard her wrong. "What?" "We get married," Alyssa said again. "Tonight, right now. We make it legal and proper before their deadline comes." Tom's head was spinning. "Alyssa, that is the one thing that makes their injunction meaningless," Alyssa finished for him. "If I am your wife, they cannot argue that I am not a proper resident. They cannot use any of their moral character nonsense. We take away their legal weapon." Tom shook his head, just trying to make sense of it all. "You are talking about—" "This ain't about some legal trick, Tom. This is about staying alive," Alyssa explained. "And yeah, it is a strategy, but it is also—" She hesitated, a brief shimmer of vulnerability crossing her features. "It is also because I came out here to make a life with you. This might not be the way either of us drew it up, but what we have is real, and it is something worth fighting for." Tom felt the solid ground beneath his boots turn to sand. Marrying Alyssa, a woman he had known for barely 3 weeks, had somehow become the one person he could not imagine living without. The whole idea was wild, it was reckless. It was exactly the kind of thing Sarah would have given him heck for. But it was also the smartest play they could make. And beneath all that, in a place deeper than words, it just felt right. "What happens if this plan falls apart?" he asked, his voice low. "What if they just cook up another way to come at us?" "Then we will face them side by side," Alyssa said, "as partners. Legally, emotionally, all of it." Tom looked deep into her eyes, trying to find a trace of doubt or fear. He found nothing. There was only that same blazing resolve that had carried her to his doorstep in the middle of a thunderstorm. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. "I rode through a lightning storm to find you," Alyssa answered. "I am not about to turn back now." Something solid settled deep in Tom's chest. A choice, a promise, a leap of faith into a future he could not see. "All right," he said. "Let's get it done." An hour later, they had everyone gathered in the cabin. Elias looked like he had been struck by lightning. Clara was beaming. Miguel and Jonas just looked puzzled but ready to help. "We are going to need a preacher," Tom announced. "Preacher Wells lives down in town," Elias offered. "But getting him to come all the way out here this late at night—" "I will go get him," Clara said right away. "He knows our family. He will come for me." She was gone in a flash. The rest of them sat there, wound tighter than a $2 watch, listening for the sound of trouble that never came. Tom wore a path in the wooden floor, his thoughts racing a mile a minute. Was this a crazy thing to do? You bet it was. But maybe crazy was just what the doctor ordered. Alyssa stood near the window, her gaze fixed on the blackness outside. Tom walked over and stood next to her. "You know you can still back out of this," he said softly. Alyssa turned to face him. "Can you?" Tom's mind went to Sarah, to the guilt he had shouldered for 6 long years, the heavy feeling that moving on was the same as forgetting her. But looking at Alyssa in that moment, he understood something Sarah had tried to tell him before she passed. Loving her did not mean he had to lock his heart up forever. The best way to honor her memory was to live his life fully, not to let it wither away. "No," he said, "I cannot change my mind. I do not want to." A smile spread across Alyssa's face, bright and warm like the sun rising over the canyon. "Good." 2 hours later, Clara came back with Preacher Wells in tow. He was a skinny man in his 60s, looking completely baffled but resolute. He carried his Bible and his legal authority as an ordained minister. "Well, this is all highly unusual," he said, his eyes taking in the armed group of people inside Tom's cabin. "Everything about our situation is unusual," Tom told him. "But we need this done, legally, tonight." The preacher looked at Tom's face, then at Alyssa's, and seemed to find something there that set his mind at ease. "All right, son. but we are going to do this by the book. No cutting corners." They stood together before the stone fireplace. Tom was in his work clothes, and Alyssa wore the same shirt and pants she had on all day. There was no fancy gown, no bouquets of flowers, and no guests other than the small band of folks who had stood with them through it all. Wells opened his Bible, and the ceremony began. The old, familiar words washed over Tom. They were traditional, formal, and they carried a power he had not anticipated. When the preacher asked if he took Alyssa to be his wife, Tom's voice came out strong and clear. "I do." When the question was put to Alyssa, she looked Tom straight in the eye and said, "I do," with a certainty that left no room for doubt. They did not have any rings to exchange or any special vows they had written. But when Preacher Wells declared them man and wife and told Tom he could kiss his bride, the kiss they shared was honest and deep, filled with defiance and promise and hope. When they finally pulled apart, the whole room was smiling. Tom even saw a grin on Jonas's face, and he had never seen that man smile before. Wells signed his name on the marriage license and gave it to Tom. "This is legal and binding," he said. "Properly witnessed and recorded. They cannot touch it." Tom stared down at the piece of paper, at his name joined with Alyssa's, and he felt a feeling he could not quite name. It was not exactly happiness, but a profound sense of rightness. He knew that no matter what came next, he had made a choice worth making. Alyssa took his hand and gave it a tight squeeze. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For picking me? For putting up a fight? For believing this could all work out?" Tom squeezed her hand right back. "We are a team now. Legal, official, the whole deal." "Together," Alyssa repeated, and the word felt like an anchor in the middle of a hurricane. They spent their wedding night standing guard, rifles resting on their laps, their eyes scanning the darkness for a threat that never came. It was not the romantic night either of them might have dreamed of, but it was their reality. And as the first light of dawn began to paint the canyon gold, Tom sat beside his wife and felt something he had not felt in 6 years. He felt that maybe, just maybe, the future held something more than just getting by. It held the promise of actually living again. The marriage certificate landed on District Attorney Hewitt's desk at 9 o'clock in the morning, sharp. Tom had delivered it himself. He walked right into the county office with Alyssa on one arm and Elias watching their backs. Hutt glanced up from his desk, saw the three of them standing there, and his face changed from annoyed to calculating in a blink. "Mr. Redford," Hutt said, choosing his words with care, "what can I do for you today?" Tom slid the certificate right across the polished wood. "I just thought you should be aware. Your injunction does not mean a thing anymore. My wife now legally resides on my property." Hewitt snatched up the document and scanned it. Tom watched the exact moment the man understood he had been completely outplayed. A muscle in his jaw jumped. "This is some mighty convenient timing," Hewitt remarked. "It is legal timing," Alyssa corrected him. "Signed by a licensed minister of the cloth with witnesses and filed with the county clerk first thing this morning. Everything is done by the book." Hewitt placed the certificate back on his desk like it was something fragile. A marriage of convenience, used to get around a legal order, could be grounds for... "For what?" Tom cut in. "You want to prosecute 2 people for getting married? Good luck with that in a courtroom." Hewitt's eyes turned to ice. "Do not think for a second that this is a win, Mr. Redford. The county still has serious concerns about public safety, damage to property, and the ongoing civil disturbances. The injunction concerning the oversight of your property is still very much in effect." "Then you had better enforce it legally," Tom replied. "But you cannot use my wife's presence on my land as your excuse any longer." That reason just went up in smoke. Tom started to walk away, but Hutt's voice stopped him cold. "You think you are a clever man, but all you have done is postpone what is coming. This whole situation will be settled one way or the other." Tom glanced back over his shoulder. "Well, then I guess we will see you in court." They stepped back out into the morning sun, which seemed to shine brighter and feel cleaner than it had in weeks. Alyssa let out a long breath that was part laugh and part relief. "That felt really good," she said. Do not start celebrating just yet, Elias warned. He is right about one thing. They will just look for another way to come at us. Let them try, Tom said. From now on, at least we are fighting them from higher ground. But as the words left his mouth, Tom knew the real fight was far from over. The marriage protected Alyssa's legal right to be there, but it did not fix the bigger problem. Frank was still out there somewhere. The attacks were still going on, and men like Caldwell and Hewitt were not the type to quit just because one of their plans failed. When they rode back to the ranch, Sheriff Lyle was there waiting for them. The grim look on his face told Tom that whatever news he had, it was not good. "Found Frank," Lyle said, getting straight to the point. Tom's heart hammered in his chest. "Where? Is he dead?" Lyle said it flat out. "In a ravine about 15 miles north of here. He was shot twice in the back." The words hit like rocks thrown into a calm pond, sending ripples of shock through the air. Tom tried to wrap his mind around what it all meant. "Who did it?" Alyssa asked. "Who would do that?" "We do not know yet," Lyle confessed. "But whoever it was, they wanted him to be found. They left the body right out in the open. Did not even bother to cover it up." He took a breath. "And there is more. We found some things at his campsite. Kerosene cans that match the ones used to burn the courthouse. We found receipts, notes, letters." "With who?" Tom demanded. Lyle looked him square in the eye. "Judge Caldwell, District Attorney Whitt, and 3 men from the County Land Commission." He pulled a stack of folded papers from his coat pocket. Frank was keeping a detailed record of every instruction they gave him, every single time. Payment for every single order, just to ramp up the pressure. The world seemed to spin under Tom's feet. They were working together, using him as their pawn in this whole dirty game. Lyle added, "They were already planning to buy your land right after they ran you off. They had the papers and everything ready, all set to carve up the property between themselves." Alyssa's face turned pale with a cold fury. They cooked this whole thing up. The raids, the fires, the legal games. Every last bit was a calculated move to steal the ranch. "That's how it looks," Lyle said with a nod. "And now their hired muscle is gone, and he took their secrets to the grave with him. Except he wasn't nearly as dumb as they figured. He wrote it all down." Tom took the documents, and his disbelief grew with every word he read. It was all right there in black and white. The dates, the dollar amounts, the exact instructions. Caldwell telling Frank to make life a living hell for Redern. Wheat signing off on payments for jobs done to help the county's so-called interests. The Land Commission was even talking about splitting up the property before Tom had ever been officially pushed to sell. "This is a conspiracy," Tom said, his voice low. "It is fraud, a criminal conspiracy." "You are right," Lyle agreed. "And it's enough to bring the law down on them. But we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "These fellas have pull, connections, and deep pockets. To bring them down, you need more than just proof. You need the will of the folks in charge, and that means we have to get the territorial governor involved." Lyle's face was grim. "I sent a message to the capital, but until we get a reply, we are walking on dangerous ground. These men know they have been found out, and a cornered coyote is the most dangerous kind." Tom knew exactly what he meant. Caldwell and Hewitt would know by now that Frank was dead. They would be scrambling to clean up their mess, get rid of any proof, and build their defenses. And if they were willing to conspire and try to kill a man for the ranch, they would not think twice about doing worse to save their own hides. "We need protection," Elias said plainly. "Real protection. Can you give us that, Sheriff?" Lyle took a breath. "I can put some deputies out at the ranch, but I only have 3 men in my whole department, and one of them is 70 years old. If Caldwell decides to bring a real fight to your door, I cannot promise you I can stop him." "Then we take it to the people," Alyssa said, her voice sharp. "Before they have a chance to make a move, we take this proof, and we show every person in this town exactly what these men have done." Tom looked over at her. "You want to call another town meeting?" "No," Alyssa said, her eyes shining with a fiery cleverness. "I want to hold a trial, right in the town square, in the bright light of day, where every soul can see and hear the truth for themselves. Lyle frowned. That is not how the law works. What they did to us was not legal either, Alyssa shot back. They used the look of the law to cover up their crimes. We will use the look of justice to drag them into the light. It was a bold idea, maybe even against the law itself, and for sure a huge risk. But as Tom looked at the proof in his hands, at the written record of all the corruption and scheming, he felt a hot, righteous fire start to burn in his chest. A people's court, he said, the words coming out slow. Exactly, Alyssa agreed. We lay out all the evidence, we let the town be the judge, and we make Caldwell and Hewitt answer for their actions. Lyle just shook his head. They will never agree to that. They would never stand for that kind of public shaming. Then we will make them, Tom said. We will announce it to everyone. We will invite the man the territorial governor sent. You said you sent for help. They will send someone to look into this. We will make it so they have nowhere left to hide. Sheriff Lyle thought it over, caught between the letter of the law and knowing the whole system was broken. In the end, he gave a slow nod. All right, but we are going to do this by the book. This is not about mob rule or taking the law into our own hands. This is about bringing the truth into the daylight. They used the next 2 days to get ready. Elias saddled up and rode out to the other ranches, telling everyone what they had found and what they were fixing to do. Clara went around and spoke to the women in town, getting them on their side after they had been quiet for so long out of fear. Miguel and Jonas made sure the town square was secure, leaving no room for any surprises or ambushes. Meanwhile, Tom and Alyssa put all the proof in order. They built a story of the conspiracy so clear and simple it could not be denied. Judge Caldwell got wind of their planned meeting on the second day. He sent a message of his own, a formal warning telling them to stop this illegal gathering right now. Tom sent a short reply back. You are welcome to come and stop us. The morning of the tribunal was crisp and cold. Tom was awake before the sun came up, with Alyssa still asleep next to him. She was his wife now, a fact that still felt brand new and powerful. He just watched her for a second, noticing the firm set of her chin even while she slept, and he felt a thankfulness so strong it hurt. She had ridden straight through a storm to find him, faced down threats, legal trouble, and the whole town turning against her. She had stood right by his side when running away would have been the easy and safe thing to do. And she chose to stay, she chose to fight, and she chose him. Tom touched her shoulder lightly. It is time to get up. Alyssa's eyes snapped open. She was alert, like someone who had learned to sleep with one eye open. Today is the day. Today is the day, Tom agreed. They put on their Sunday best, nothing fancy, just clean and proper. This was not a showdown with guns they were headed for. It was something bigger, a fight for what was right and true. When they got to town, the square was already filling up with folks, a whole lot more than Tom figured would come. There were ranchers from the far-off spreads, town merchants, mothers with their little ones, and even a few of Caldwell's usual crowd, who were either curious or had a change of heart. Elias had built a small stage in the middle of the square. It was simple and sturdy, and you could see it from anywhere. Sheriff Lyle was standing close by with his deputies. They were there to keep the peace, but they were not taking sides. And sitting on a bench near the edge of the crowd, looking both important and mighty interested, was a fella Tom had never seen before. He wore an expensive suit, had sharp eyes, and carried himself like a man who was used to giving orders. Lyle caught Tom's eye and tipped his head toward the stranger. A territorial governor's man, he said, got in late last night. He is here to watch what happens and report back. A spark of hope lit up in Tom. This was real now. Official. Whatever went down here today would be heard about far beyond Mesa Ridge. At 9 o'clock sharp, Tom walked up onto the platform. The crowd went quiet. Thank you all for being here, Tom said, his voice ringing out across the square. We are here today because the very laws meant to keep us safe have been twisted. They have been used as a tool by powerful men to take land and ruin good people. A low rumble went through the crowd. Tom saw Caldwell standing near what was left of the courthouse with Hewitt and two county commissioners right beside him. They tried to look calm, but Tom could see how stiff and nervous they were. 3 weeks ago, Tom went on, a woman rode up to my ranch. Her name is Alyssa, and now she is my wife. She came to settle a debt because 20 years ago I pulled her from the floodwaters at Red Creek. That one simple act of kindness started a whole campaign of trouble, violence, and legal attacks meant to run us off our land. He held up the papers he got from Frank, lifting them for everyone to see. These documents prove what we all suspected. They show that Judge Caldwell, District Attorney Hewitt, and some of the County Land Commission hired Frank Mallory to scare us. They paid him to set fires to our property, to shoot at our house, and to stir up trouble so they could have an excuse to take our ranch. The crowd exploded. People were shouting, some in disbelief, some in anger, all wanting to see the proof. Caldwell pushed his way forward, his face beet red. "That is slander," he yelled. "Just a bunch of lies made up by a man who is desperate." "These are Frank Mallory's own words," Tom said, his voice cutting clean through the uproar. "It is all here in his own handwriting. Every order you gave him, every dollar you paid him, every crime you told him to commit." Alyssa joined Tom on the platform, and the crowd got quiet again, waiting to hear what she had to say. "When I came to this place," Alyssa began, her voice steady and loud, "I figured I was coming somewhere that a person's words still meant something, where folks looked out for one another. But what I found was a place where powerful men did as they pleased, as long as they dressed it up in the words of law and order." She stared right at Caldwell. "You accused us of wrongdoing to justify your attacks. You talked about public safety to cover up your scheme. You burned down your own courthouse and then pointed the finger at us for the mess you made." "Prove it!" Hit shouted from the crowd. "Where is your proof?" Tom raised the papers again. "Right here. Do you want to come look them over, or should we hear from some witnesses first?" Rosita Delgado stepped out of the crowd. "I will speak. I heard Frank bragging about the fires, saying he was just following orders. Miguel Santos stood beside her. I saw county men meeting with Frank in secret more than once. Then, one after another, more people came forward. Folks who had been too scared to say anything before were now finding their courage together. The stories built up like a flood, a wave of truth that was impossible to stop, and it washed away all of Caldwell's denials. The man from the territorial office was writing as fast as he could in his little book, getting it all down. Finally, Caldwell just lost it. He shoved his way through the people and stomped onto the platform, his face turning a dark shade of purple. "This is a sham," he hollered. "An illegal meeting that means nothing." "You are right about one thing," Tom said softly. "This is not a courtroom. It is something much more important. This is the truth being told for all to hear, and the only thing that matters now is if you can stand there and deny it." Caldwell opened his mouth to speak, but then he shut it. For the very first time since Tom had known him, the judge looked lost. "The evidence will have its say," the territorial investigator said as he stood up. His voice had a weight to it that made the whole crowd fall silent. "I have heard more than enough to start a full investigation. Judge Caldwell, District Attorney Hewitt, you are both relieved of your duties until the territorial government can look into this." Caldwell's face went pale as a sheet. "You can't." "I can," the investigator replied. "And I am. Sheriff Lyle, you are hereby in charge of keeping order until we can send replacements." Lyle stepped up, his hand resting on his gun. "Judge, I am going to have to ask you to come with me. You too, Mr. Hewitt. We have some questions for you about how Frank Mallory died, among a few other things." Everyone understood what that meant. Frank was not just a hired gun. He had become a problem, and someone had made sure that problem went away for good. Hewitt's face turned a sickly gray. "I want a lawyer." "You will get one," Lyle told him. "Back in the territorial capital where this case is going to be heard." Tom stood and watched as Lyle led both men away, along with the county commissioners who were in on the whole crooked deal. The crowd was abuzz, everyone talking at once, trying to make sense of what they had just seen. The investigator walked over to Tom and Alyssa and held out his hand. Matthew Graves from the Territorial Attorney's Office. What you all did here was not exactly by the book, but it surely got the job done. Your evidence is going to be the key to making this right. Will it be enough? Tom asked. These are mighty powerful men. They were powerful, Graves corrected him. Now they are just men facing the law. And with the papers you have, plus all these witnesses, we have got a strong case. He took a breath. There will be a trial, a real one this time. You will both have to testify. We will be there, Alyssa said, her voice firm. Graves nodded. In that case, I reckon justice will be served. He tipped his hat and walked off, leaving Tom and Alyssa on the platform as the crowd slowly started to head home. Elias climbed up to meet them, a smile on his face, which was a rare sight. You did it. You really went and did it. We all did it, Tom said, looking around at everyone who had stood with them. Rosita and Miguel, Clara and Jonas, Preacher Wells, who had married them when things looked bleak. Even Sheriff Lyle, who finally found the backbone to do the right thing. They had won, not with bullets or with fear, but with the simple truth, spoken loud enough for everyone to hear. The trial kicked off about 6 weeks later, right in the heart of the capital. For 2 whole days, Tom and Alyssa were on the stand, laying out the evidence, answering every last question, and staring down those city lawyers who tried their best to tear them down. But the paperwork was just too clean. Frank's ledgers were too perfect, and the stories from the witnesses all lined up. In the end, Caldwell and Hewitt were found guilty on all counts: conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder by proxy, and a whole mess of other charges. The county commissioners, they saw the writing on the wall and took plea deals to testify. The judge didn't hold back on the sentences. Caldwell got himself a 15-year stay in the territorial prison. Hewitt was looking at 12 years. The commissioners were stripped of their titles and their good names. And the ranch, Tom and Alyssa's home, was declared theirs for good, free, and clear, with every last claim against it wiped away. When they finally got back to Mesa Ridge, the whole town felt different, like a heavy blanket had been lifted. It was like a wound that had festered for years had finally been cleaned out and could start to heal. Folks who used to look right through them now gave a respectful nod. Store owners welcomed them in with warm smiles. And over at the general store, old man Hicks, of all people, actually cracked a smile when he saw them. Heard the news, Hicks said with a gruff nod. Good to see justice done right for a change. Tom just nodded back, not quite knowing what to say. But Alyssa gave his hand a little squeeze, and that said everything. Back home at the ranch, a surprise was waiting for them. Elias, Miguel, Clara, and Jonas had been working non-stop. The burned section of fence was brand new. The barn stood tall and strong again, fresh water lines were in the ground, and the corral was bigger than before. Just call it a wedding gift, Elias said, grinning at their stunned faces. And a thank you for reminding all of us what it means to stand your ground. That evening, Tom and Alyssa stood out on their porch, just watching the sunset paint the canyon with streaks of gold and deep red. The land rolled out in front of them, rugged and beautiful and tough, and every inch of it belonged to them. You still figure it was all worth it? Tom asked, his voice low. Alyssa leaned her weight against him, solid and warm. Every single second, every argument, every bit of risk. Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her in tight. So, what's next for us? Next, Alyssa turned and smiled up at him. Now, we just live. We build this place up. We plant some seeds, both in the ground and for our future. We'll raise some cattle, and maybe one day, we'll raise some children, too. We showed everyone that the life we wanted was worth the fight. Tom let that sink in, thinking about the future stretching out just like that canyon, wide open and full of possibilities. He thought about Sarah, at peace on the hill beneath the cottonwood tree, her memory now a comfort instead of a heavy weight. He looked at the woman right beside him, the one who had charged through a thunderstorm to settle an old score, and ended up building a new home. You know the craziest part of all this? Tom said. What's that? The night you rode up in that storm, I truly believed my life was over. Figured I was just waiting for the clock to run out. He turned to look her straight in the eye. "You didn't just save my ranch, Alyssa. You saved me." Alyssa's eyes shined with unshed tears. "You saved me first 20 years back. And you saved me again 3 weeks ago when you told me I could stay." "Best dang decision I ever made," Tom said softly. "Second best," Alyssa corrected him with a little smile. "The best one was marrying me." Tom let out a real laugh then, a deep, honest sound that echoed off the porch. "Well, I can't argue with you there." They stood together as the sun finally disappeared, letting the first stars pop out in the darkening sky. Down in the yard, they could hear Elias showing Miguel a thing or two about handling a horse. Clara and Jonas were talking about where the fences for the spring crops ought to go. It was the sound of a community, a family, of a life being built piece by piece. Far off in the distance, Tom heard the low rumble of thunder rolling through the canyon. Another storm was on its way. But this time he wasn't standing there to face it all by himself. He had Alyssa. He had friends who had been tested by fire and proven true. He had land that was his, earned with truth, not with bullets. The future was still a big question mark. There would be other struggles, other hard times, and plenty more storms to get through. But standing there, holding his wife's hand in his, Tom felt something he had not felt in 6 long years. It was hope. A real solid hope that settled deep in his bones. And as the first few drops of rain started to fall, gentle this time, bringing life instead of destruction, Tom Redford smiled and pulled Alyssa just a little bit closer. They had made it through the worst of it. Everything else from here on out was just living, and they were damn sure going to do a whole lot of that.